Blood and money have a specific scent, distinct from the truffles and aged Barolo served at table 4. Rosa knew the smell well enough to keep her head down. But when a ruthless syndicate boss brings his old-world father to dinner, silence isn't an option. One simple, terrified greeting spoken in a dialect supposed to be dead stopped the most dangerous men in the city dead in their tracks. It was just a shift, until she opened her mouth. Sweat pooled at the small of Rosa's back, soaking into the cheap polyester of her uniform. She shifted her weight, the rubber soles of her non-slip shoes squeaking faintly against the black marble floor of Lagata. It was an ugly sound, a blue-collar sound that had no business existing inside a private dining room that smelled of roasted bone-marrow beeswax candles and the faint, sterile bite of ozone that clung to men who carried guns. Rosa didn't care about the guns. She cared about rent. Her right arch throbbed a dull, rhythmic ache that kept time with the heavy ticking of the mahogany grandfather clock in the corner. 7 hours into a double shift, her hands were starting to shake. That was the real danger. Not the men sitting around the table, but the heavy silver tray, balanced on her left palm, loaded with crystal decanters of wine that cost more than her car. If she dropped it, she was fired. If she was fired, she was homeless. The stakes were painfully simple. She stood in the shadows near the heavy velvet drapes, making herself small. That was the trick to surviving the private rooms. Be furniture. Be a ghost. At the head of the table sat Leo Moretti. He didn't look like the romanticized mobsters on television. There was no slick charm, no easy smile. He was a jagged edge of a man poured into a charcoal bespoke suit that looked uncomfortably tight across his shoulders. His dark hair was cut ruthlessly short. When he breathed, the fabric strained. He had the restless, violent energy of a trapped animal pretending to be civilized for the evening. Rosa had served him 3 times before. He never looked at her. He tipped in crisp, uncreased $100 bills folded perfectly in half left under an empty Scotch glass. Tonight, Leo was sweating. Just a microscopic sheen of moisture at his temple, catching the amber light of the chandelier. The syndicate boss was nervous. Rosa tightened her grip on the edge of the tray. The metal bit into her palm. She watched the heavy oak doors of the private room, waiting. The entire kitchen staff had been on edge since 3 o'clock. "The father is coming," the maitre d' had hissed, wiping his forehead with a linen napkin. Vincenzo Moretti. Vincenzo had been deported 20 years ago. He was a ghost from a brutal era, a man who had supposedly ruled the Palermo docks with a rusted meat hook and a polite smile. Now he was back in the city, and his first stop was dinner with the son who had inherited his blood-soaked throne. The heavy doors groaned open. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Leo stood up instantly. His chair scraped violently against the floor. The 4 men flanking the room, human walls of muscle and bad intentions, straightened their spines. Rosa pressed her shoulder blades into the floral wallpaper, wishing she could melt through the plaster. Vincenzo Moretti did not look like a monster. He looked like an old, tired man. He was short, barely clearing 5'5", wearing a tan trench coat over a thick wool sweater that smelled faintly of mothballs and cheap tobacco. He shuffled into the room, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. His face was a map of deep ravines, skin like cured leather with dark, wet eyes that darted around the opulent room with undisguised contempt. "Leo!" the old man rasped. His voice sounded like dry leaves crushed underfoot. "Papa!" Leo stepped forward, his massive frame dwarfing the older man. He reached out to embrace him, but Vincenzo held up a single gnarled hand. The rejection was casual, but the temperature in the room plummeted. Leo's jaw clenched. A muscle ticked rapidly under his eye. He lowered his arms, stepping back. "You eat in a museum." Vincenzo muttered, poking the plush rug with the rubber tip of his cane. He didn't speak English well. The words were thick, choked by a heavy accent. Too much light, too much gold, smells like a whore's parlor. Leo swallowed hard. It's the best restaurant in the city, Papa. I wanted you to have the best. The best! Vincenzo mocked, limping toward the table. He didn't wait for one of the guards to pull out his chair. He grabbed it himself, hauling it back with surprising strength, and collapsed into it with a heavy sigh. He waved a dismissive hand. Bring the wine. My throat is full of airplane dust. Leo snapped his fingers. The sound cracked through the air. Rosa's stomach plummeted. It was her cue. She pushed off the wall, forcing her exhausted legs to move with steady, practiced grace. The silver tray was suddenly 100 pounds heavier. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She approached the table from the right, keeping her eyes firmly fixed on the crisp white linen of the tablecloth. Don't look at them. Pour the wine. Retreat. Survive. She stepped up to the old man's chair. The smell of him was overwhelming, up close stale smoke peppermint and the distinct metallic tang of old age. She leaned in, reaching for his empty crystal glass to replace it with a fresh one before pouring the Barolo. Her sleeve brushed his elbow. It was a tiny mistake, a fraction of an inch of miscalculation. But in a room wound this tight, it was a disaster. Vincenzo flinched violently, his hand snapping out faster than a rattlesnake. His gnarled fingers clamped around Rosa's wrist like a vice. The grip was shockingly painful. Rosa gasped, the heavy silver tray tilting dangerously. A single crystal decanter wobbled, clinking sharply against another. "Stupida!" Vincenzo hissed. His eyes snapped up, locking onto Rosa's. They weren't the eyes of a tired old man anymore. They were flat black and completely merciless. He rattled off a rapid, furious string of Italian. Not just Italian, a thick, guttural dialect that sounded like stones grinding together in the dark. Rosa froze. The breath caught in her throat. Her wrist throbbed in his grip. The room went entirely still. She could feel Leo's gaze burning into the side of her head, cold and deadly. She was supposed to apologize. She was supposed to beg forgiveness in quiet, polite English, clean up whatever mess she made and vanish. But exhaustion does strange things to the brain. Panic strips away filters. And the dialect Vincenzo was using, the harsh, clipped consonants, the swallowed vowels, bypassed Rosa's customer service instincts entirely. It hit a nerve buried deep in her childhood. It was the exact cadence of her grandmother, furious and mourning in a cramped kitchen, screaming at a world that had taken everything from her. Without thinking, Rosa looked dead into the Mafia boss's eyes. "Lasciami iri o ti scipu l'occhi." The words tore out of Rosa's throat before her brain could stop them. "Let me go, or I'll tear out your eyes." It wasn't standard Italian. It wasn't even standard Sicilian. It was a hyper-specific, archaic slang from a microscopic cluster of villages nestled in the brutal hills outside of Corleone. It was dirt-poor language, blood-feud language. It was the way women spoke when they were holding a butcher knife and had nothing left to lose. The moment the words hit the air, Rosa's stomach dropped into an icy abyss. She realized what she had just said. She realized who she had just said it to. The blood drained from her face so fast she felt instantly lightheaded. Her vision narrowed to the white knuckles of the old man's hand still clamped around her wrist. "I'm dead," she thought. The cynicism that usually kept her afloat evaporated, leaving only a cold, primal terror. "I am actually going to die in a polyester uniform." The reaction in the room was instantaneous yet entirely silent. It was as if the air pressure had suddenly tripled. The 4 bodyguards around the perimeter didn't draw weapons, but their hands moved smoothly, instinctively, disappearing inside their jackets. They stopped breathing. Leo Moretti sat completely paralyzed. He had half risen from his chair when his father grabbed Rosa, ready to intervene, ready to drag the clumsy waitress out by her hair to appease the old man. But now Leo was frozen in a half-crouch, his dark eyes wide, locked onto Rosa in absolute bewilderment. He didn't know the exact words she had used. Leo was born in America, his Italian was polished and corporate, but he understood the tone. He understood the violence in it. Vincenzo didn't move. The old man's grip on her wrist remained iron-tight. His jaw hung slightly slack. The dark, wet eyes that had looked at her with such contempt a second ago were now stretched wide in profound shock. He stared at her face, searching her features as if trying to rip a mask off her skull. The silence stretched. It was agonizing. Rosa could hear the erratic squeak of her own shoe as her foot trembled on the marble. She could smell the metallic fear sweating out of her own pores, overpowering the garlic and expensive wine. "Uni si cresciuta," Vincenzo whispered. "Where were you raised?" His voice was different now. The anger was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting disbelief. The dialect rolled off his tongue, thick and heavy. Rosa swallowed. Her mouth was completely dry. Her survival instinct screamed at her to answer in English, to play dumb, to apologize and run. But the old man's grip was inescapable, and the sheer gravity of his stare anchored her in place. "All'Umira di Roccabusambra," she stammered, her voice barely a thread. In the shadow of Roccabusambra. It was the mountain her grandmother always talked about. The jagged peak that loomed over the village they had fled. Vincenzo let go of her wrist as if she had suddenly caught fire. He slumped back into his heavy mahogany chair, all the air rushing out of his lungs in a ragged wheeze. He lifted a trembling hand and covered his mouth, his eyes never leaving Rosa. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk through a brick wall. "Papa!" Leo's voice cracked like a whip, sharp and full of sudden panic. He abandoned his chair, taking a heavy step toward the old man. "Papa, what is it? What did she say?" Vincenzo ignored his son. He slowly lowered his hand. The cruel lines of his face had softened, sagging with a sudden crushing weight. When he spoke again, he switched to heavily accented English, his voice shaking. "You." Vincenzo pointed a thick, trembling finger at Rosa. "Your blood. Who is your family?" Rosa clutched the silver tray against her chest like a shield. She rubbed her aching wrist with her free hand, her mind racing. "I just work here, sir. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have spoken. I'm so sorry." "Do not apologize to me." Vincenzo slammed his hand flat on the table, making the crystal glasses rattle. The bodyguards flinched. Leo stepped in front of his father, placing himself between the old man and Rosa. "That's enough!" Leo snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned his dead-eyed stare on Rosa. "Get out, now!" Rosa didn't need to be told twice. She turned her non-slip shoes, squealing loudly against the floor, and practically ran for the swinging kitchen doors. The heavy tray banged against her hip. She could feel Leo's murderous glare burning into her spine every step of the way. Behind her she heard Vincenzo's voice rising in sudden, desperate anger. "Bring her back, Leo, you fool. Do you know what she just spoke? Do you know whose tongue that is? Bring her back!" Rosa hit the kitchen doors with her shoulder, bursting into the chaotic heat and noise of the prep line. The smell of frying oil and burned sugar hit her like a physical blow. She slammed the tray onto a steel counter, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't unclasp her fingers. She leaned over the sink, gasping for air, staring down at the drain. Roccabusambra. Her grandmother had made her swear never to speak that dialect outside the house. "It is a language of graves," Rosalia, her nonna, used to whisper, braiding her hair with trembling fingers. "You speak it, and the dead will hear you." Rosa gripped the edge of the stainless steel sink, the cold metal biting into her palms. The kitchen roared around her, oblivious to the bomb she had just detonated in the dining room. She closed her eyes, fighting a wave of nausea. She had just spoken to the dead, and the dead had answered. The kitchen doors swung open behind her with a violent crash. The noise of the line stopped dead. Rosa slowly turned around. Leo Moretti stood in the doorway. He had shed his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a dark smudge of a tattoo on his collarbone. He wasn't looking at the chefs or the maitre d', who was currently shrinking into a corner. He was looking exclusively at Rosa. And he didn't look angry anymore. He looked like a man who had just found the one piece of a puzzle that could destroy his entire life. "You," Leo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "My father wants you to pour the wine." Leo Moretti didn't grab her. He didn't have to. He simply turned his broad shoulders, clearing a path through the crowded, stunned kitchen line, and waited. Rosa looked at the open door, then down at the steel sink. For a fraction of a second, she calculated the odds of bolting out the back alley exit. It was 30 feet away. She could make it to the subway before they even realized she was gone. But her mind flashed to the uncreased $100 bills Leo always left, and the stories whispered among the busboys about what happened to the union rep who tried to shake down one of the Moretti's front companies. You don't outrun these people. You just die tired. She picked up the heavy silver tray. It rattled against the frantic shaking of her hands. Leo watched her, his face a completely unreadable mask. As she stepped past him into the carpeted hallway, he fell in right behind her. He was too close. She could feel the ambient heat radiating off his chest, smell the expensive sandalwood cologne masking the sharp, acrid scent of his own adrenaline. "Keep your eyes down," Leo said. His voice was a low vibration pitched only for her. It wasn't a threat. It was an instruction. "Pour the wine. Do not speak to him. If he speaks to you, you look at me." Rosa nodded once, a stiff, jerky motion. They re-entered the private dining room. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, sealing off the noise of the kitchen. The silence inside was oppressive. The 4 bodyguards had not moved an inch. They were statues with guns. Vincenzo Moretti was sitting exactly as she had left him. Both hands were planted flat on the white tablecloth, his breathing shallow and rapid. When Rosa walked in, his dark, wet eyes snapped to her, tracking her every movement with a hunger that made her skin crawl. Rosa approached the table. Her right arch screamed in protest. She forced herself to focus entirely on the crystal decanter of Barolo. She lifted it. The red liquid sloshed heavily against the glass. "Don't spill. Just don't spill." She leaned over Vincenzo's shoulder. She could hear the faint, wet rattle in his lungs. She tilted the decanter, pouring exactly 4 ounces of the dark, ruby wine into his glass. A single drop caught on the lip of the crystal. She gave the decanter a sharp twist, catching the drop before it could stain the pristine white linen. A professional to the bitter end. She moved to step back. "Your grandmother," Vincenzo rasped. Rosa froze. She didn't look at him. She looked across the table at Leo, who had taken his seat opposite his father. Leo's dark eyes locked onto hers, holding her gaze with terrifying intensity. He gave a microscopic shake of his head. "Don't speak." "Your grandmother." Vincenzo repeated, his voice gaining strength, cutting through the silence like a rusted blade. "What was her maiden name?" Rosa swallowed hard. The silence stretched. Leo leaned forward, placing his forearms on the table. "Papa, leave the girl alone," Leo said, his voice smooth, heavily, modulated to sound reasonable. "She's a waitress. You're scaring her. Let her do her job." Vincenzo didn't even look at his son. He kept his eyes fixed on Rosa's wrists, studying the cheap plastic watch, the faded burn scar on her forearm from a deep fryer. "You tell me her name," the old man demanded, his accent thickening, slipping back into the guttural cadence of the old country. "Was she a Lobianco or Greco? Did she come from the valley or the ridge?" Rosa's throat felt like it was coated in sand. She looked at Leo again. The syndicate boss was staring at his father now, a muscle ticking violently in his jaw. The careful corporate control he usually projected was cracking. He didn't like being ignored, and he didn't like not knowing what was happening in his own territory. My grandmother's name was Rosie. Rosa lied. Her voice cracked, betraying her fear, but she forced the words out. Rosie was the Italian equivalent of Smith. It meant nothing. It was safe. Vincenzo let out a sound that was half laugh, half cough. It was a wet, ugly noise. Rosie, he mocked. He finally picked up the wine glass, his gnarled fingers wrapping around the stem. He took a sip, his eyes never leaving Rosa. A Rossi does not know the curse of the Busambra wind. A Rossi does not use the dialect of the boneyards. He set the glass down with a sharp clack. You lie to me, little bird, Vincenzo said softly. But you do not lie well. The blood in your face betrays you. The anger in your jaw. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking incredibly tired, as if the brief surge of adrenaline had drained the last of his life force. You have the eyes of a woman who watched her brothers burn. Rosa felt the blood drain from her face. Her breath hitched. Her grandmother had never spoken of brothers. She had never spoken of how they left Sicily, only that they could never ever go back. But on the nights when the fever took her, the old woman used to scream about the smoke. She used to scream about the smell of burning olive wood and roasting meat. Papa, Leo said. The word cracked like a gunshot. He stood up, pushing his chair back so violently it tipped over, crashing onto the marble floor. The bodyguards flinched, their hands hovering over their lapels. Leo ignored them. He planted his hands on the table, leaning aggressively toward his father. I have spent 2 weeks setting up this dinner. I brought you here to discuss the Port Authority contracts. I did not bring you here to interrogate the hired help about ghost stories from a dirt-poor rock that hasn't mattered in 50 years. Vincenzo slowly turned his head to look at his son. The old man's eyes were completely dead. You own the city, Leo. Vincenzo whispered. You wear the suits, you buy the judges, but you know absolutely nothing. He pointed a trembling arthritic finger at Rosa. That girl, she is a ghost, and if she is here it means the graves we dug before you were born are empty. Rosa didn't wait to be dismissed. She backed away from the table, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She hit the heavy oak doors, pushed backward through them, and didn't stop walking until she was buried in the deepest, darkest corner of the walk-in freezer, gasping for cold, sterile air. The digital clock in the employee break room read 2:14 a.m. Rosa slammed her locker shut. The metal clanged loudly in the deserted hallway. The restaurant was completely silent now. The kitchen was scrubbed down, smelling of harsh industrial bleach and lemon degreaser. The ovens were cold. She had been fired at 11:30 p.m. The maitre d' had pulled her aside into the narrow hallway by the dish pit. He hadn't yelled. He had just handed her an envelope with her week's cash, avoiding eye contact. You made the Moretti table uncomfortable, Rosa? You know the rules? She didn't argue. There was no point. You don't argue with management when the Mafia is sitting in room A. She had stripped off her polyester vest, folded her apron, and waited in the break room for the rest of the shift to end so she could walk to the subway with the dishwashers. There was safety in numbers. But the dishwashers had left 20 minutes ago. She had fallen asleep sitting on the uncomfortable plastic bench, completely exhausted by the adrenaline crash. Now she was alone. Rosa slung her cheap canvas backpack over her shoulder and pushed through the heavy steel exit door. The November air hit her like a wet towel. It was freezing, a damp, bone-deep cold that cut right through her thin denim jacket. The alleyway behind Lagata smelled of rotting fish-wet cardboard and stale beer from the dive bar next door. The only light came from a single flickering yellow sodium bulb bolted above the door. She turned up her collar, shoved her hands into her pockets, and started walking toward the mouth of the alley. Her right arch was still throbbing. She needed to make the 2:45 a.m. train, or she'd be waiting on the platform until 4. She made it exactly 10 steps. A heavy matte black town car was idling near the dumpsters, its headlights off. The deep purr of the engine was barely audible over the distant siren of a police cruiser. White exhaust curled from the tailpipe, vanishing into the dark. Rosa stopped dead. Her pulse spiked, hammering in her throat. A figure detached itself from the shadows of the brick wall. Leo Moretti was smoking a cigarette. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. His white shirt was stark against the grime of the alley. He took a slow drag, the cherry of the cigarette illuminating his sharp jawline and the heavy exhausted bags under his eyes. He exhaled a long plume of smoke and flicked the butt onto the wet asphalt, grinding it out with the toe of an ox-blood leather shoe that cost more than her apartment. "You missed your train," Leo said. His voice was flat. No inflection. Rosa's grip tightened on the straps of her backpack. She calculated the distance back to the heavy steel door. Too far. He was closer. "I'll catch the next one," she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. "I was fired, Mr. Moretti. You don't have to worry about me spilling wine on your father ever again. We're done." Leo let out a harsh, bitter breath that might have been a laugh in another life. He pushed off the brick wall and took 2 steps toward her. Rosa forced herself not to back away. "Done," Leo repeated, testing the word. "You think this is about a job?" He stopped a few feet away from her. Up close, without the barrier of a mahogany table and crystal glasses, he was terrifyingly large. He carried the kind of casual, relaxed posture that only belonged to apex predators. "My father left the restaurant an hour ago." Leo said, his eyes scanning the empty street at the end of the alley before settling back on her. He didn't go to his hotel. He went to a payphone in a bodega in Queens. He made 3 calls to Palermo. He spoke in the same dead language you used. Rosa's stomach plummeted. A payphone. That meant he didn't want the syndicate listening. He didn't want his own son listening. "I don't know anything," Rosa said quickly, her voice rising in panic. "I swear to God, I grew up in Brooklyn. My grandmother raised me. She's dead. I don't know anyone in Sicily. I just remembered the words she used when she was angry." "It doesn't matter what you know." Leo interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, sudden and sharp. "It matters what he thinks you know." He reached into his pocket. Rosa flinched, bracing herself for a gun. Instead, Leo pulled out a heavy set of keys. "My father is a paranoid, violent old man who ruled a cartel by cutting the tongues out of his rivals," Leo said, stepping closer. The smell of sandalwood and ozone rolled off him. "He believes your grandmother belonged to the only family that ever truly humiliated him. The family he spent 10 years trying to wipe off the map. He thinks you are a loose end." Rosa couldn't breathe. The alley walls felt like they were closing in. "Then why are you telling me this? Why don't you just let him kill me?" Leo stared down at her. For a second, the cold corporate mask slipped entirely. Underneath it was a man drowning in a war he hadn't asked for. "Because I run a business, not a slaughterhouse," Leo snarled softly. "Because I just spent 5 years legitimizing this family, and I am not going to let a senile ghost from Corleone drag me back into a blood feud over a waitress who couldn't keep her mouth shut." He hit a button on his keys. The locks on the town car clicked open with a heavy thud. "Get in the car," Leo commanded. Rosa shook her head, backing away a single step. "No, I'm going home. I'm locking my door." "If you go home," Leo said, his voice completely devoid of emotion, "the men my father just woke up in Palermo will be at your apartment by tomorrow night. They will not ask polite questions. They will peel the skin off your arms until you tell them exactly who your grandmother was." He opened the heavy armored rear door of the car. He looked back at her, his dark eyes absolutely merciless. "You can get in the car with me and you might live to see Friday," Leo said. "Or you can walk to the subway and you can disappear. Choose." Rosa didn't have a choice. She knew it. He knew it. She stared at the open door of the town car. The interior was pitch black, a cavern of leather and silence. Her right arch gave a sudden vicious throb, sending a sharp spike of pain up her calf. It was the physical anchor she needed to snap her out of her paralysis. She hitched her cheap canvas backpack higher on her shoulder and slid into the back seat. Leo climbed in right behind her, bringing the smell of cold asphalt and smoke with him. He pulled the heavy door shut. It didn't just close, it sealed. The click of the latch sounded like a bank vault locking down. Instantly, the ambient noise of the city, the distant sirens, the hum of the streetlights, the wind rattling the garbage cans was completely erased. "Drive," Leo said. The driver, a massive man with a thick neck and a shaved head, didn't confirm the order. He just put the car in gear, and the town car glided smoothly out of the alley. Rosa pressed herself against the far door, putting as much space between herself and the syndicate boss as the leather bench would allow. The seat was heated. It felt obscenely luxurious against her freezing, exhausted muscles. She hated how good it felt. She stared out the heavily tinted window as the wet streets of Brooklyn blurred past, distorted by raindrops, streaking across the bulletproof glass. "Where are we going?" she asked. Her voice was embarrassingly small, muffled by the thick acoustics of the cabin. "Somewhere my father doesn't own," Leo replied. He was leaning back against the headrest, his eyes closed. In the intermittent flash of passing streetlights, he looked 10 years older than he had in the restaurant. The sharp, immaculate predator was gone, replaced by a man carrying a staggering amount of weight. Which narrows the list considerably. Rosa hugged her backpack to her chest. It contained her wallet, $30 in tips, half a pack of gum, and a crumpled bus schedule. Her entire life. She was currently sitting next to a man who likely made her annual rent in the time it took her to pour a glass of wine. "You said he made calls to Palermo," Rosa said, forcing the words through her dry throat. "You said he thinks my family humiliated him. My grandmother was a seamstress. She made alterations at a dry cleaner in Bay Ridge. She couldn't even afford proper arthritis medication." Leo opened his eyes. He turned his head slowly, looking at her in the dark. "The old families didn't care about money, Rosa," he said quietly. He knew her name. Of course he did. He probably knew her social security number and her credit score by the time he walked out of the kitchen. They cared about blood. They cared about respect. If your grandmother was a Busambra, if she came from that specific ridge outside Corleone, she belonged to the faction that butchered my father's 2 older brothers in 1978. Rosa stopped breathing. "My father retaliated," Leo continued, his voice devoid of any inflection. He sounded like he was reading a grocery list. "He burned their olive groves. He burned their houses. He made sure anyone with that specific dialect, that specific bloodline, was either put in the ground or put on a boat. He thought he finished it. And then tonight, a waitress serving him a $2,000 bottle of Barolo tells him she'll tear his eyes out in the exact tongue of the ghosts that haunt him." Leo let out a heavy breath, turning his gaze back to the partition separating them from the driver. "He doesn't see a terrified girl from Brooklyn," Leo said. "He sees a seed that he forgot to crush. He sees a threat to the legacy he built with a meat cleaver. And Vincenzo Moretti does not tolerate threats." Rosa squeezed her eyes shut. A sharp, stinging heat pricked behind her eyelids. She wasn't going to cry. Crying was useless. Her grandmother had taught her that. Tears are just water, Rosalia. Save them to boil the pasta. "I don't even know the language," she whispered, her voice cracking. She used to yell those words when she was having nightmares. I just repeated them. It was a stupid, reflexive mistake. In my father's world, there are no mistakes, only messages. Leo shifted, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a slim black cell phone. It wasn't a smartphone. It looked like a cheap burner. He tossed it onto her lap. Take the battery out of your personal phone. Now, leave it on the seat. Rosa hesitated. But my landlord... If your landlord calls you, my father's men will triangulate the cell tower. Leo interrupted his tone, hardening the corporate patience vanishing. Take the battery out, Rosa, or I will throw the phone out the window. She unzipped her backpack with trembling fingers, fished out her cracked smartphone, and pried the back casing off. She popped the battery out and set both pieces on the expensive leather seat between them. It felt like severing the last tether to her actual life. She was adrift now. The car took a sharp turn, the tires hissing against the wet pavement. They were leaving Brooklyn. Rosa could see the massive illuminated steel arches of the bridge looming ahead through the windshield. They were heading into Manhattan. If you hate the old ways so much, Rosa asked, her voice gaining a fraction of its usual cynical bite, why did you bring him here? Why have dinner with him at all? Leo didn't answer immediately. He stared at the bridge cables flashing by, slicing the yellow city light into rhythmic, strobing bars. Because you can't run a legitimate empire if the old country refuses to sign the deed, Leo said softly. I needed his blessing for the port contracts. I needed him to formally hand over the docks. Instead, I got a blood war over a waitress. He looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. You better hope we find a place to hide you, because right now you are the most expensive mistake I have ever made. Gravel crunched under the heavy tires. The town car didn't pull up to a glamorous penthouse or a fortified mansion. It rolled down a steep concrete ramp into the subterranean parking garage of a half-finished commercial high-rise in Tribeca. The air down here smelled of wet cement, PVC glue, and stagnant water. Construction equipment sat abandoned in the shadows like sleeping mechanical beasts. The car stopped. The driver killed the engine. Dominic, Leo said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet cabin. Park it 2 blocks away. Keep your radio on. Don't fall asleep. Yes, boss. The massive driver grunted. Leo pushed his door open. The damp, freezing air of the garage flooded the heated cabin. Rosa shivered, clutching her denim jacket tight around her chest as she slid out. Her feet hit the concrete, and a sharp jolt of pain shot up her leg. She winced, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from making a sound. Leo didn't wait for her. He was already walking toward a heavy metal fire door at the far end of the garage, his dress shoes clicking sharply against the concrete. Rosa limped after him, her non-slip soles squeaking faintly. He unlocked the fire door with a physical key. No electronic keypads, no keycards. He pushed it open, revealing a dark, concrete stairwell. Oh, 4 flights, Leo said, looking back at her. He noticed her limp. His eyes dropped to her cheap black work shoes, then back to her face. He didn't offer to help. He just started climbing. Rosa gritted her teeth and followed. Each step was a fresh agony. 7 hours of carrying heavy trays, followed by a surge of pure terror, had left her muscles feeling like lead. By the 2nd flight, she was panting her breath, fogging in the cold stairwell. By the 3rd flight, she was actively angry. I am going to get murdered because of a dialect I don't even understand, she thought, dragging herself up the last few steps. I am going to die because I bumped a mafioso's elbow. Leo pushed open the door on the 4th floor. He reached out and flicked a heavy breaker switch on the wall. A row of harsh, industrial fluorescent work lights buzzed to life, flickering violently before settling into a steady, hum-inducing glare. Rosa stepped into the room and stopped. It was a completely gutted corporate office floor, stripped to the concrete pillars and exposed ceiling ducts. Coils of thick black wire hung from the rafters like dead snakes. Rolls of fiberglass insulation were stacked in the corners. There was no furniture, no carpet, just 3,000 square feet of empty, dusty space. "It's a shell company," Leo said, walking toward the center of the room. He pulled his phone from his pocket, instantly typing out a message. "We bought the building 6 months ago to renovate. The permits are stalled. It's off the grid. No cameras, no security logs, no paper trail linking it back to me. My father doesn't know it exists." Rosa stood near the door, feeling incredibly small in the massive, hollow space. She dropped her backpack onto the dusty concrete. "There's no heat," she observed, her teeth chattering slightly. "There's no running water either. Or beds," Leo replied without looking up from his phone screen. "But there are no bullets flying through the windows. It's a trade-off." He hit send on his message and slid the phone back into his pocket. He turned to face her. He looked exhausted. The sharp lines of his face were drawn tight, the shadows under his eyes pronounced in the harsh fluorescent light. He unbuttoned his cuffs and slowly rolled his sleeves up to his forearms, revealing scars that didn't look like they came from corporate boardrooms. "Sit down," Leo ordered, pointing to a stack of drywall near the center pillar. "Get off your feet." Rosa didn't argue. She limped over to the drywall and sat down heavily. A cloud of fine white dust puffed up around her jeans. She didn't care. She reached down and untied her left shoe, peeling it off her foot. The relief was instant, followed immediately by a sharp, burning sensation. A massive, angry red blister covered the back of her heel, the skin already raw and weeping. She peeled off her sock with a grimace. Leo watched her in silence. He didn't look away out of modesty, nor did he look with pity. He observed her the way a general observes a soldier checking their gear, assessing the damage, calculating how far she could run if she had to. "I have a shift on Tuesday," Rosa said quietly, staring at her ruined heel. The absurdity of the statement tasted like ash in her mouth. "If I miss 2 shifts, they fire me permanently. The maitre d' said I was suspended, but—" "You don't have a job anymore, Rosa," Leo said, his voice flat. He walked over to a blue plastic cooler sitting near the wall, popped the lid, and pulled out 2 bottles of water. He tossed one to her. She caught it clumsily against her chest. It was freezing cold. "You don't have an apartment anymore, either." Leo continued, opening his own bottle and taking a long drink. "By sunrise, my father's men will have torn your place apart. They will find your mail. They will find your grandmother's old documents. They will confirm exactly who you are. You cannot go back there." Rosa stared at the condensation forming on the plastic bottle in her hands. The reality was finally sinking in. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, hollow void. "So what happens to me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Do I just live in a gutted office building forever? Or do you wait until the heat dies down and then shoot me yourself to make him happy?" Leo paused with the water bottle halfway to his mouth. He lowered it slowly. He looked across the dusty, barren room, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The silence between them was heavy, entirely devoid of the polished corporate bullshit he used on the rest of the world. "If I wanted you dead," Leo said softly, "you would still be in the alley." Morning didn't break. It bled through the filthy industrial windows in pale grey streaks. Rosa opened her eyes. Her neck cracked audibly as she tried to lift her head from the rolled-up denim jacket she had used as a makeshift pillow. The concrete floor had leached every ounce of heat from her bones during the night. She shivered violently, a deep, involuntary tremor that started in her chest and rattled all the way down to her unlaced shoes. She sat up slowly. Dust coated the back of her throat like fine sandpaper. She swallowed, wincing at the dry, scratchy friction. Leo was already awake, or perhaps he had never slept. He was standing by the massive pane of floor-to-ceiling glass on the far side of the gutted floor, staring down at the street 4 stories below. He had shed his white dress shirt sometime during the night. He wore a ribbed black undershirt that hugged the dense, heavy muscle of his back and shoulders. The dark smudge of ink she had seen at his collarbone extended over his left shoulder, a jagged, ugly tattoo of a crow, pinned by a dagger, fading and blurred with age. It wasn't the kind of ink you got in a parlor. It was the kind you got in a cell. Rosa dragged her gaze away from him, looking down at her own disastrous state. Her polyester uniform was crumpled and stained with a faint smear of grease from the kitchen. Her blistered heel throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. She felt entirely disgusting. "Is there a bathroom?" she croaked. Her voice sounded like a rusty hinge. Leo didn't turn around. He pointed a single finger toward a dark hallway near the elevator bank. "Third door on the left. The water is shut off to the sinks, but the toilet tank is rigged to a jerry can. Don't waste it." Rosa pushed herself up off the drywall stack. Her legs felt like hollow, brittle wood. She limped across the expansive concrete floor, the silence of the building magnifying the pathetic squeak of her single shoe and the soft-socked thud of her other foot. The bathroom was a concrete box, smelling strongly of chemical bleach and old copper pipes. She did what she needed to do in the near darkness, splashed some of her bottled water onto her face, and stared at her reflection in the dirty, cracked mirror above the dry sink. She looked exactly like a woman who had just lost her entire life over a spilled glass of wine. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes. Her dark hair, usually pulled into a severe health code-compliant bun, was unraveling in frizzy, chaotic strands around her face. "You survived the night," she told herself. It was a bleak comfort. Surviving just meant the execution was delayed. When she limped back into the main room, Leo was sitting on a metal sawhorse holding his burner phone. The screen cast a harsh blue glow against his jaw. He looked up as she approached. "My men went by your apartment," Leo said. There was no greeting, no good morning, just the brutal immediate facts. Rosa stopped walking. The cold in the room suddenly felt infinitely sharper. And my father's people got there first." Leo dropped the burner phone onto the sawhorse next to him. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely together. "They ripped the door off the hinges, gutted the mattress, smashed the drywall looking for floorboards or hidden safes. They took every piece of paper in the place, mail bills, receipts." Rosa stared at him. A strange, hollow ringing started in her ears. "They took my grandmother's tin," she whispered. "Describe it." "It was an old shortbread tin, red tartan pattern." Rosa's voice was completely detached, floating somewhere above her body. "It had her immigration papers, her death certificate, a few Polaroids of the neighborhood in Bay Ridge. That was all I had of her. That was everything. They took it." Leo confirmed. His voice wasn't sympathetic. It was clinical. "Which means by now Vincenzo knows your grandmother's maiden name was actually Busambra. He knows she arrived in New York in 1979. He knows she was from the specific bloodline he tried to eradicate." Rosa let out a shaky breath, sinking down onto the stack of drywall. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs. "Why didn't she tell me?" Rosa asked, staring blankly at the dust motes dancing in the grey morning light. "She raised me for 18 years. She never mentioned a Mafia war. She never mentioned brothers being murdered. She just told me to stay out of trouble, pay my taxes, and never ever speak that dialect, because trauma makes liars of us all." Leo said. It was the most human thing he had said since she met him. He didn't say it with pity. He said it with the exhausted authority of someone who knew the truth of it firsthand. She thought if she didn't say the words out loud, the past couldn't track her down. But blood doesn't wash out Rosa. Not in my family and not in yours. Rosa looked up at him. "So what now they know who I am? I don't have a home. I don't have a job. I have exactly $30 in my backpack. Do I just wait here until you figure out how to use me as bait?" Leo's eyes narrowed slightly. He stood up, towering over her sitting form. "You aren't bait," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "Bait gets eaten. I am trying to build a wall around you before my father burns this entire city down looking for a ghost. But if you want to survive this, you need to stop acting like a waitress who missed her shift and start understanding that you are currently the most dangerous weapon in New York." Dominic returned just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, carrying a heavy canvas duffel bag and a brown paper sack that smelled aggressively of roasted garlic-cured meat and sharp provolone. Rosa's stomach let out a violent, echoing growl the second the scent hit the stale air of the office floor. She hadn't eaten since a handful of stale fries scavenged from the bus tub at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. The massive driver didn't say a word to her. He set the paper bag on a spool of industrial wire, dropped the canvas duffel at Leo's feet, and retreated to the stairwell to stand guard, completely impassive. Leo opened the paper bag and pulled out 2 thick submarine sandwiches wrapped in butcher paper. He tossed one to Rosa. She caught it awkwardly, almost dropping it. "Eat," Leo commanded, unwrapping his own sandwich. Rosa didn't need to be told twice. She tore the paper back. The bread was crusty and fresh, the meat salty and rich. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She ate with an ugly, feral desperation, completely abandoning any pretense of manners. She was halfway through the sandwich before she realized Leo was watching her, chewing his own food slowly, his dark eyes unreadable. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, suddenly hyper-aware of the grease on her chin. "Sorry," she mumbled, defensive. "I usually get a shift meal. I skipped it yesterday." "Don't apologize for being hungry," Leo said softly. He tossed his half-eaten sandwich back onto the butcher paper and nudged the canvas duffel bag with the toe of his shoe. "I had Dominic pull some things from one of the safe houses." He unzipped the bag. Inside were a stack of folded clothes, a few basic toiletries, and a small stereo first aid kit. "There are clean clothes in there," Leo said, nodding towards the bag. "Sweatpants, t-shirts. They won't fit well, but they don't smell like deep fryer grease. Use the wipes to clean that blister on your heel. Bandage it. If it gets infected down here, I can't take you to a hospital." Rosa stared at the duffel bag. A strange, suffocating tightness gripped her chest. It was a bizarre, contradictory feeling. This man was the reason she was a target, the reason her life was reduced to ash and rubble. Yet he was also bringing her food, providing clothes, and making sure she didn't die of sepsis. "Why are you doing this?" Rosa asked the question, slipping out before she could bite it back. She dropped the remainder of her sandwich onto her lap. "You could have just handed me over. You said it yourself, your father wants my bloodline erased. Hand me over, get your port contracts, and go back to your penthouses and your tailored suits." Leo went completely still. The ambient hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to grow louder in the heavy silence. He stepped closer to her, his movements predatory and silent despite his heavy shoes. He stopped inches from where she sat on the drywall. Rosa had to tilt her head all the way back to look him in the eyes. "Because my father doesn't get to dictate who lives and dies in my city anymore," Leo said. His voice was a razor blade, cold and incredibly sharp. "Because for 20 years he ran this syndicate like a butcher. He hacked people to pieces over petty slights, bad gambling debts, and bruised egos. When he got deported, I took over a fractured, bleeding, paranoid empire. I scrubbed the blood off the ledgers. I bought the politicians. I made us untouchable." He leaned down, planting one hand on the drywall, right next to Rosa's thigh. The smell of sandalwood and raw metallic aggression washed over her. "I am not going to let a paranoid old man drag my family back into the Dark Ages to fight a phantom war against a Corleone seamstress." Leo snarled softly, his face inches from hers. "You are proof that his brutal methods failed. You are proof that he didn't finish the job. He wants you dead because you are the living, breathing evidence of his incompetence." Rosa swallowed hard. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "So, I'm just a political prop." "You are leverage," Leo corrected. He pushed himself back up to his full height, the dangerous proximity broken. "My father is mobilizing loyalists, men who still believe in the old ways, men who think I'm too soft, too corporate. They are using you as the excuse to start a civil war within the syndicate. If he kills you, he proves he still has the power. If I keep you alive—" "You prove you're the boss?" Rosa finished the cynicism, finally cutting through her fear. She let out a humorless laugh. "Great. I'm a trophy in a Mafia pissing contest." A muscle ticked in Leo's jaw. He didn't deny it. "Clean your foot," he said coldly. "Change your clothes. We aren't staying here tonight." Rosa paused, holding the first aid kit she had just pulled from the bag. "Where are we going?" Dominic ran the plates on the cars circling this block. Leo set his eyes scanning the dusty, empty floor. "My father's people are already closing in. They know I have you. They just don't know exactly where. This building is a dead end. We have to move." "Move where?" Leo looked at her, his expression grim. "I'm taking you to the only place in the state my father's men cannot step foot without starting a bloodbath. I'm taking you to my house. Antiseptic wipes possess a sharp chemical hostility." When Rosa pressed the small square of medicated alcohol against her ruptured heel, the pain didn't just sting. It bit deep into the nerve, shooting a hot wire of agony straight up to her knee. She bit down hard on the inside of her cheek, tasting copper, refusing to make a sound. Leo watched her from the center of the dusty floor, his face an unreadable mask of exhaustion and calculation. He didn't offer help. He just waited. Rosa peeled the plastic backing off a thick hydrocolloid bandage and smoothed it over the raw skin. She discarded her polyester uniform right there on the concrete, a crumpled, grease-stained monument to the life she was being forced to abandon. The clothes Leo had provided were comically large. The heavy grey sweatpants swallowed her legs, and the black cotton t-shirt hung off her frame like a tent. But the fabric was soft, completely devoid of the suffocating synthetic itch she was used to, and it smelled faintly of expensive laundry powder and cedar. "Put your shoes on," Leo instructed, his voice cutting through the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Dominic is bringing a different car to the loading dock. We leave in 2 minutes." The transit was a masterclass in suffocating tension. They didn't go back through the parking garage. Dominic led them down a pitch-black maintenance stairwell that smelled of mildew and rat poison, emerging into a narrow, trash-strewn alley a block away from the building. A matte black SUV was idling by the curb, completely unmarked and coated in a fine sheen of cold November drizzle. Rosa climbed into the back. Leo slid in beside her, bringing a rush of damp air with him. The doors locked with a heavy, definitive thunk. The drive took over an hour, pulling them away from the claustrophobic concrete canyons of Manhattan and out toward the sprawling, heavily wooded enclaves of the North Shore. The silence in the cabin was dense enough to choke on. The rain picked up, drumming a frantic, irregular rhythm against the reinforced roof. Rosa kept her forehead pressed against the tinted glass, watching the city lights bleed out into the dark, replaced by the imposing shadows of ancient oak trees and wrought iron fencing. She was entirely adrift. 24 hours ago, her biggest fear was making rent. Now she was a high-stakes pawn riding in a bulletproof convoy, wearing a syndicate boss's oversized shirt, fleeing a ghost war she didn't even understand. The SUV slowed, turning sharply off the wet asphalt and onto a long, winding driveway paved with crushed grey gravel. There was no gaudy mansion at the end of the road, no marble fountains or statues. Leo's house was a brutalist masterpiece of poured concrete black steel and massive sheets of reinforced glass, half buried in the side of a densely forested hill. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a modern architectural bunker. As they pulled up to the heavy steel front doors, Rosa noticed the men. They weren't wearing the sharp suits of the restaurant bodyguards. They wore dark, tactical rain gear, standing silently under the dripping eaves of the roof and patrolling the tree line. They didn't carry umbrellas. They carried compact, short-barreled rifles slung tight against their chests. "Stay close to me," Leo said, his hand gripping the door handle. Rosa followed him out into the freezing rain. The smell of wet pine needles and ozone hung heavy in the air. She kept her head down, intensely aware of the cold, assessing eyes of the perimeter guards, tracking her every limping step. Leo keyed a code into an invisible keypad set flush into the concrete wall, and the heavy steel door hissed open. Inside the house was a jarring contrast to the violent reality outside. It was perfectly silent, the temperature regulated to a comfortable dry warmth. The air smelled of beeswax, old paper, and a faint hint of wood smoke. The floors were vast expanses of heated, dark slate. Minimalist furniture sat like art installations in the center of massive, open-concept rooms. "Dominic," Leo called out, stripping off his wet jacket and tossing it onto a minimalist bench. "Post 2 men at the bottom of the driveway. Nobody comes through the gate. Not even the captains. If my father calls the house line, reroute it to the burner." "Done, boss." The massive driver grunted, disappearing down a long, dimly lit hallway. Leo turned to Rosa. She stood awkwardly on the slate floor, her oversized clothes dripping rainwater onto the pristine stone. She wrapped her arms around her chest, suddenly feeling incredibly exposed in the vast, sterile wealth of the room. "Upstairs," Leo commanded, gesturing toward a floating glass and steel staircase. Rosa climbed the stairs, her bandaged heel aching with a dull persistence. Leo led her down a corridor lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out into the pitch-black forest, finally stopping at a heavy wooden door. He pushed it open. The guest bedroom was larger than Rosa's entire apartment. A massive king-sized bed dominated the center, covered in a heavy charcoal duvet. There was a sitting area, an ensuite bathroom lined in dark marble, and a wall of windows completely obscured by thick, motorized blackout shades. "The bathroom is stocked," Leo said, leaning against the doorframe, watching her take in the room. "There is food in the kitchen downstairs if you want it later, but you do not open the shades. You do not touch the windows. The glass is rated to stop a rifle round, but my father's men use thermite." Rosa stopped in the center of the plush rug. She turned around to face him. The sheer absurdity of her situation finally breached the dam of her exhaustion. "This is insane!" she whispered, her voice trembling with a potent mix of fear and sudden sharp anger. "You brought me to a fortress. You have men with assault rifles in your yard, over a waitress." "I told you," Leo replied, his dark eyes absolutely flat. "This isn't about you. It's about what you represent. I represent a minimum wage paycheck and bad archers, Mr. Moretti." Rosa snapped back the Corleone temper her grandmother always warned her about, finally flaring up. "I am a human being. I have a life. You can't just keep me locked in a concrete box until your father dies of old age." Leo pushed off the doorframe. He crossed the room in 3 long, silent strides, closing the distance between them until he was entirely in her personal space. The anger rolling off him was a physical pressure heavy and suffocating. "Your life ended the second you spoke that dialect in my dining room," Leo said, his voice dropping to a vicious, quiet rumble. He stared down into her eyes, stripping away every ounce of her defiance. "The woman who worked double shifts and worried about rent is dead. If you walk out those front doors, my father will make sure of it. So you are going to sit in this concrete box, and you are going to let me dismantle a syndicate war before it burns this city to ash. Do you understand me?" Rosa's breath hitched. She looked up at the ruthless, exhausted syndicate boss, realizing exactly how trapped she was. "Yes," she whispered. "Good." Leo turned on his heel. He walked out into the hallway and pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The lock engaged with a loud metallic click. Rosa was entirely alone. Will Rosa survive the golden cage of the Moretti estate, or will Vincenzo's ghosts tear down the walls before Leo can stop them? The war for New York's underworld has officially begun, and a waitress from Brooklyn is the spark that lit the powder keg. If you're hooked on this gritty, slow-burn mafia romance, do not scroll past, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share this video with your fellow romance readers. Drop a comment below with your predictions for the next part. The blood feud is just getting started, and you won't want to miss the explosive fallout.